Hey everybody, it's Dr. Keegan, and I'm back with our weekly video lecture for week 2 of our course, Gender and Popular Culture. And we only had sort of 1 day's worth of scheduling this week because of Labor Day. So you might have noticed that there was quite a bit of material to work through in the second half of the week. I'm going to be providing some frameworks today for you to work through that material. And then also giving you the discussion exercise for the week, which will actually ask you to apply some of the terms and frameworks we're practicing with in this unit. We're beginning, which is on analyzing pop culture from gendered, raced, sexual, and sexualized perspectives. So we're beginning today with a little bit of work on basic feminist analysis and how it applies to visual culture, which you might have picked up from the reading. Today, I want to practice reading gender texts by introducing you to how the theory of intersectionality might help us better read or interpret pop culture texts. Okay, let's get started. So, you might have noticed we had a short reading on intersectionality, which may be a term you've heard before in other courses, but it does have specific applications in cultural studies, particularly when we're looking at visual culture. So I wanted to quickly explain a bit about how we're going to be using that term in this course before I have you kind of practice generating multiple intersectional readings of a text at the end of the class. So, intersectionality, as you might know, is a Black feminist theory that comes out of Black women's experiences of simultaneous oppression, racial, sexual, and gender and class oppression all at once. A theory for how these multiple vectors of oppression and power are always simultaneously operating, right? So we can't isolate out just racial analysis without simultaneously considering how gender might be affecting that analysis. Last video, we did a very simple single axis racial analysis of some of the artifacts in Kendrick Lamar's video, All Right, but I mentioned, right, that like we couldn't necessarily stop there if we were going to do a full reading of that text because we would have to consider how dominant codes of masculinity and femininity, of class, of a bit of ability and disability also show up in that text and are worked through simultaneously with that racial iconography, right? So again, intersectionality is one way of saying we have to always be thinking about multiple vectors of oppression at the same time because they co-constitute one another culturally. And we don't experience them in isolation. We have a race, we have a gender, we have a sexuality, we have a body, right? All at once. And so none of these things can really be isolated. Okay. So we know power does not simply work in a unilateral manner. People are empowered and oppressed simultaneously and uniquely in all situations. So it's not as simple as a binary where there are people with power and people who don't have any. It's much more complicated. Some people might have racial privilege over other groups, but also simultaneously not have gender privilege. So we need to be thinking about how those things multiply empower and oppress people in unique scenarios. So why intersectionality in this class? Well, it's very valuable for understanding how multiple audiences might see a text differently, right? We're going to practice this later on in this video and for the group discussion this week for the class. But a text can support lots of different readings at the same time. I mentioned just with this the sign or artifact of the helicopter in the Kendrick Lamar video we watched, a Black audience member might respond to that sign differently than a white one, depending on our relative position within the police state. So intersectionality is one way of thinking through, meaning is relative based on social position, okay? For example, we could think of texts that might be both feminist, but also uphold sort of the privilege and power of white people, which would then exclude women of color from watching it in sort of in a comfortable way, right? So a movie like The Help which was kind of marketed to white audiences as a history of the civil rights movement, but that really centered white women's role in that history over women of color, right? This is a text that's interested in a feminist reading of the civil rights movement, but only from a white perspective. And so it excludes women of color, who are, again, the help, right? Or we could say that a text might be both interested in gay experience, but only white, rich gay experiences, right? Thereby excluding sort of working class gay people. Something like Will and Grace is very, very interested only in the lives of sort of elite gay men, and isn't a text that is that open to working class perspectives, right? So we think about how these texts sort of are working along multiple vectors simultaneously, and that really affects whose perspective is actually reflected by them. So in order to think through preferred readings of texts, we have to be aware of what the dominant modes of gendered representation and consumption are in our culture. So, of course, as I just said, no one in their own lives experiences total privilege or oppression. Cultural texts do reflect what we have in our culture, which is this idea of normative ideals of race, gender, sexuality, right? We know that there are ways we are supposed to be, and there are dominant codes for gender, sexuality, and race that we are constantly compared against, that sort of live as conceptual frameworks. So in terms of gender, the ideal masculinity in our culture is called hegemonic masculinity. The ideal masculinity in US culture, it presents manhood as strong, patriotic, stoic, and asserting physical dominance over everybody, basically, women as well as other men who are not as dominant, right? So when we think of action figures or heroes, of superheroes, of the sort of even the masculinity of really powerful men in US culture, it's almost always this articulation of dominating, physically aggressive, takes no shit, doesn't take no for an answer, right? And there's a very limited range of sort of emotional expression that men are supposed to have if they're going to meet these standards. I would also say that hegemonic masculinity is an implicitly white form of masculinity. The other normative ideal for gender is what is called emphasized femininity. It's sort of, and we call it emphasized because often the woman is present only to reflect and emphasize the desires of the man, right? So she emphasizes and complements hegemonic masculinity. And this is a representation of women as conforming to heterosexual male fantasies of attractiveness and passivity, right? So these might seem very familiar. You could think about G.I. Joe and Barbie, right, as two really sort of stock examples of gender norms in our culture. And then there's this theory we're going to be working with a lot next week called the male gaze, which comes from film theory, from a feminist film theorist named Laura Mulvey. And very simply, just to touch on this now, we could say that the male gaze is one idea about how most visual media is designed by men and for a male viewer in mind. So even if we are not a man, we are watching media designed for men to view, and it's arranged to appeal to men, and so we each sort of internalize that gaze, even though we might not be male ourselves, right? So the male gaze presents women through this idea of emphasized femininity as largely as objects for white straight male consumption. And one really easy way to describe the gendered relations of hegemonic masculinity and emphasized femininity, as sort of stated by John Berger in a really, really famous and useful book called Ways of Seeing, is that men act and women appear, right? Women appear to be looked at and men do the looking. That's sort of the dominant visual relations of gender in US and North American culture. So even though the male gaze reflects a very narrow group of people, right? White, cis, straight, middle-class men, um, it's a dominant way of looking and gazing, right? Gazing, looking at images that we all internalize and learn because it's everywhere we look, basically. So we're all taught to perceive culture through the structure of gender that the male gaze sets up for us. And so none of us are sort of innocent of it. And that's the thing to note here is that it's the male gaze, but it's not only men who gaze this way because it's everywhere. Um, so it appears across nearly all forms of visual culture. And I'd like you to get better at noticing the male gaze. And I'd like you this week, while you're looking at pop culture, to start looking for examples of it and saving them. Because the next week's discussion, I'm going to ask you to actually present a few examples that you found of the male gaze. I'll share a few that are really obvious, right? We're going to be talking more about Marilyn Monroe later in class. But this image of her skirt blowing up while the man watches, right, is a really famous instance of this. You could think about advertising that uses women as objects to sell completely unrelated products to men, right? Like what does Budweiser have to do with this woman who's lying on a giant bottle of beer? Like this very, very clear use of the male gaze. Right. Why would you take a turkey out of the oven in your underwear? That doesn't seem super safe or practical. But so the reason this is here is to attract men to this product they're trying to sell, which is deodorant, which is unrelated to turkey, right? There's a lot going on here that just relies on objectification of women's bodies to make associations between various things work that are completely unrelated. Um, uh, the classic sort of Looney Tunes version of this. Um, and so this is everywhere, but of course it's not totalizing, right? So one thing we'll practice also is how resistant viewers who are looking for oppositional readings of text can actually resist, contradict, or strategically ignore the male gaze. And that's something that we'll be working on next week when we look at Black, women's, and queer viewers' engagement with dominant relations of looking and the different types of gaze theory that have come out of that debate. So be looking around when you're like playing video games, watching TV, looking at advertisements, watching TikTok, whatever. Be looking for instances of this. Because I'd like to build a kind of little library of examples where we practice reading for this sort of preferred dominant set of gendered relations. Okay. So that's the male gaze. We're going to dig into it much more deeply next week, but just a taste. I had you look at an introduction to a book on feminism and pop culture that explains a bit about feminism and its history and its connection to pop culture. Basically, feminism has intervened in that castigation of pop culture as propagandistic and out there just to control working class people. Feminism has actually argued for the value of pop culture because pop culture was marketed to women initially. Women were the audiences primarily, especially for film and television in the United States. And so feminism has come along and said, actually, this stuff is super useful and women love pop culture, so there must be good reasons why, right? Arguing for the value of the experience of engaging with pop culture texts while also simultaneously critiquing the patriarchal content and values of it, right? And looking at if pop culture is full of stuff like the male gaze, then how are women viewing it? And what are women's viewing practices doing to create resistance to those dominant messages and looking for other sources of pleasure and meaning in pop culture? So that's a ballpark kind of way of describing what we're going to be getting into next week and the following weeks. Right. So as I just said, feminism has developed theories for why and how women consume pop culture texts and has defended women's right to enjoy it and to make it. It's not just chick flicks, right? There are reasons why women like certain genres of pop culture that have everything to do with positing spaces where men aren't in charge, where the dominant relations of looking and gazing and gender relations are not present, right? That pop culture can offer escape from those things in reality, and we want to escape them because we want more power and freedom, right? So thinking a little critically about maybe the stuff I like isn't stupid. Maybe reality TV isn't necessarily stupid. If so many women like it, why, right? That's a good question. Feminism has had major, if uneven, effects on how gender is represented in pop culture. So we do see more women heroes. We do see less use of emphasized femininity in texts as feminism has developed these arguments. We do see more roles for women, more diversity of women's roles in pop culture, more pop culture made by women creators. But the relations of production, meaning how things get made, is still very much dominated by an institutionalized hierarchy controlled by men. I mentioned last week that very few women get to make like mainstream, really high budget types of pop culture, like mainstream Hollywood studio movies and things like that. That's still very much controlled by a sort of entrenched male elite. So we see more representation, which is in the content of the pop culture, but we don't see as many people controlling what gets made. There's less diversity behind the camera or behind the relations of production. Gendered representation has changed historically. You're probably aware that, things used to be a lot more male gazy, if you want to call it that, than they are now. One way to kind of talk about that is to look at something. For some reason, the whole lecture today is like located in 1953, because I'm going to have you look at a musical number from a Hollywood film from 1953 as part of your discussion exercise. But I wanted to start you out looking at this poster from The Creature from the Black Lagoon to show you how these dominant relations of hegemonic masculinity and emphasized femininity are classically presented, right? This is a really classical presentation of the woman who's under duress, who's there to be saved. She's a damsel. She's an object who kind of emphasizes the masculinity and power of the creature, who is the main character and the sort of main focus, the active focus here. So remember, masculinity is about action, femininity is about appearing, right? We could say that this poster really encapsulates the dominant relations of gender that a lot of the reading is talking about, and is that these dominant relations are very much a part of like classical US visual culture that really develops between the 1930s and 1960s. Okay, so this kind of big strong man, little petite helpless woman stuff, right, that I'm going to have you looking for elsewhere in your media consumption, very classical presentation of hegemonic masculinity, emphasized femininity. So there was a movie that came out in 2017 called The Shape of Water that updated these relations. And I just wanted to show, it's by Guillermo del Toro, won a bunch of Oscars. And I wanted to show you how these relations have been updated by a new film that's looking to intervene in the classical sort of like scary monster, helpless white woman narrative, right? Where here we see it's not the monster grabbing the woman, it's the woman embracing the monster and the monster hugging her back. So here we see much more equality between these two figures. There's much more intimacy, there's much more shared relationality than in the first image, which could look like the monster saving the woman, or it could look like the monster like assaulting this woman. Like maybe she doesn't want to be grabbed, right? In the second image, we see an updating and softening of these relations that tells a very different story about power dynamics between women and men, or femininity and masculinity, or white femininity and monstrosity, right? And so things have shifted, and I want to point this out, that like these relations are still structural to a lot of visual media, but they've been softened or altered in ways that really reflect feminism's success culturally in the United States and North America, right? That women have critiqued this sort of stuff and said, hey, like this is not the kind of representation we want. We want to see stories where women and men are equal and working together, right? So one way to think of as we move forward in class, sort of like when we get into more contemporary media, how have the gender relations shifted from a much more sort of static set of images to a more open and fluid set of gender relations between genders? Okay, so that's just one example, but yeah, start looking for this stuff. So not much today in terms of content because we're going to be digging in a lot further to the male gaze next week. But I want to set up the group discussion exercise for Sunday evening. Remember, you're going to be navigating over to groups and discussions and looking at the prompt and creating an entry and then replying to an entry, right, as your weekly assignment. I want to give you an alert here that to do this assignment well, you really can't just rely on this video. You have to go to the reading, look at it, look at the material on the male gaze, feminism, semiotics, and I need to see you practicing with those frameworks in your analysis. So make sure you've done the reading before you attempt this. Make sure you've taken some notes, done some highlighting, looked at points of synergy between this lecture and the material, because I'm going to be looking for more than just, can you just talk about the content of the lecture, right? So basically, what I'd like you to do is to view a classic piece of pop culture and practice looking for different intersectional positions from which to read it. So what I'll have you do, and I've linked this in the discussion instructions over on that tab, is I want you to take a look at this classic performance from Marilyn Monroe from a film called Gentlemen Prefer Blondes from 1953. You might be familiar with this already. Certainly you should be aware of this piece of pop culture somehow, because it's been remade and remade and remade. So I'd like you to watch it. Just watch it through first and then go back and rewatch it with these questions in mind, okay? First of all, I'd like you to look for instances of the male gaze and hegemonic masculinity happening in this number. In other words, I'd like you to work on what is the preferred reading? What is the dominant sort of reading that from the perspective of hegemonic masculinity, we think is going on in this number? What is it saying about hegemonic masculinity? Okay. And then once you kind of have some ideas about that, I'd like you to invert or reverse power relations and analyze it from a feminist perspective. So what is the number saying about women's empowerment and resistance to hegemonic masculinity? Okay, so I'd like you to produce a preferred reading and then an oppositional reading of the same text. Okay, that probably sounds really scary, but there's a lot to work with in this piece that I think you'll be able to pull out some ideas. And remember, these discussions are not formal writing. It's just your kind of on the fly thinking. Let me rewind for a sec. To do this, you might be like, how do I even do that? I would encourage you to look at the structural relations going on in the number. I would encourage you to think about choreography, design, color theory, like what color are things and why, right? The lyrics of the actual song, like what is Marilyn Monroe singing about? You might need to look them up or use subtitles. Tone of voice, vocal performance, physical movement, right? How are people dressed? What is going on here, right? Look for artifacts, okay? You might need to take screen grabs, take some notes about what's happening, highlight parts of the lyrics and see how they connect to images, okay? We're just getting started actually doing visual analysis here, okay? So preferred reading, hegemonic masculinity, oppositional reading, feminist reading of the text, okay? A couple other things you could consider once you get a baseline kind of close reading down is that like this is a really old film, right? So what do you think, going back to the two posters I just showed you, like what do you think this piece of music said in 1953 to audiences, like what was the dominant reading of it at that time, right? And fast forward like nearly 70 years, right? Like what is the dominant reading of it now? Has that changed? Has history changed how we view this piece? I would guess yes, it has, right? Um, so which does the dominant reading or the preferred reading, or sorry, preferred reading or oppositional reading feel more real or true or meaningful to you now, and why maybe? And another thing to think about is like this song has been re-recorded many times by other female artists, right? So we know that Madonna infamously redid this piece in Material Girl. Beyonce has re-recorded this number. Most recently, Megan Thee Stallion redid it. Um, and you could look up some of those instances and see how they update this actual number. Like Megan Thee Stallion actually reperforms this number, as does Madonna. What is going on there? Like, why would this number be popular with these sorts of recording artists much later in history? And how are they utilizing the artifacts in it possibly differently, right? Um, so all that is to say, give this a shot. Remember, you're just practicing these frameworks and terms, and you're just looking for your own interpretation of the text by using some critical frameworks. Okay. So by Sunday evening, please post something about this. And then remember, your other component here is to reply to someone else's ideas. So I'm looking for 2 posts from each group member. Okay. All right. I'll be back next week, and I'll also be posting more material for our beginning of the week this coming Monday through Friday for you to be reading. All right.